Well, it is 10:30 according to my clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to the webinar, Lead and Copper Rule Revisions 101 and Ideas on How Water Systems Can Start Preparing, which is being recorded. My name is Elena Berg, and I am a planner in the Environment and Development Department at the North Central Texas Council of Governments, or NCT-COG. This webinar is hosted by NCT-COG and was prepared in cooperation with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I just want to provide you with a brief background on what NCT-COG is. It is a voluntary association of local governments. It is one of 24 regional councils in Texas. As part of NCT-COG's water quality management planning work, we host webinars on water quality topics every quarter. If you have ideas for future topics for these webinars, please feel free to send them to me. My email address is shown on the screen. It's eberg@nctcog.org. The agenda for today's webinar is that we will start with LCRR 101 with Laura Higgins from TCEQ, and then we will hear plans and preparations for LCRR compliance from the City of Fort Worth, Stacy Walters. And then we will also get some input from small utilities today. We are fortunate that a couple have agreed to share with us today, and so we'll take time for that. And then our final presentation will be from the City of Fort Worth, Mary Gugliuzza, preparations for LCRR public outreach and risk communication. So it is my hope that this webinar is useful to you. Our recent surveys have shown that there is a desire within the region to hear from others about what they're doing to prepare for the lead and copper rule revisions. And so this webinar attempts to provide a forum to do just that, for you to listen and learn from your colleagues who are also facing the same challenges. So without further ado, let's dive right in with our first speaker. Let me give her a proper introduction. We have Laura Higgins, the team leader of the Lead and Copper Monitoring Team at TCEQ. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Microbiology from Texas A&M University and nearly a decade of experience as a laboratory scientist prior to joining TCEQ. She first joined TCEQ as a laboratory assessor and microbiology expert within the Laboratory Accreditation Group. In 2020, she joined the Water Supply Division, where she enjoys her current role as team leader for the Lead and Copper Monitoring Team. So Laura, I will pass the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Yes, as Elena said, my name is Laura Higgins. I'm the team leader for the Lead and Copper Monitoring Team here at the TCEQ. And today I'd just like to give a general overview of the lead and copper rule revisions that became effective on December 16th of 2021. Before I begin, I just want to preface that while the effective date of the lead and copper rule revisions is December 16th of 2021, the compliance date, or the date that water systems are expected to comply with this new rule, is not going to be until October 16th of 2024. So that's an important distinction to note just before we even begin anything else. Just the compliance date is October 16th of 2024. All right, next slide. All right, so what I'd like to do is give you a brief background on the lead and copper rule, then discuss EPA's intent to strengthen the lead and copper rule before we then get into some of the details of the lead and copper rule revisions. And then finally, I'd like to wrap up the presentation by talking next steps. You'll also see on this slide that I use some abbreviations. I use LCR for lead and copper rule and LCRR for lead and copper rule revisions. And I hope you'll forgive me, but it just adds a lot of text to the screen when I type out lead and copper rule revisions every single time. And it's also just a real tongue twister when you say it as many times as I do. So please just know that's what I mean when you see or hear me refer to LCR or LCRR. All right, next slide. All right, so originally published in 1991, the lead and copper rule applies to approximately 68,000 community and non-transient non-community public water systems and serves over 300 million people nationwide. So in Texas specifically, that translates to approximately 5,500 public water systems that are subject to lead and copper rule regulation. The lead and copper rule is a treatment technique regulation rather than a maximum contaminant level regulation, and it requires water systems to take action to reduce exposure to the extent feasible. Lead is generally not naturally found in Texas source waters, but rather lead from lead pipes, faucets, and fixtures can dissolve into the water or can sometimes enter as particles. So in order to keep lead from entering the water, the lead and copper rule requires some systems to treat the water using certain chemicals that keep the lead and copper in place by reducing corrosion. And when corrosion control alone is not sufficient to control lead exposure, then systems are required to educate the public about the risks of lead in drinking water, and they're required to replace those lead service lines. All right, next slide. Okay, so in order to protect all Americans from lead in drinking water, and with President Biden's vision to remove 100% of lead service lines, the EPA announced that during their executive order directed review of the LCRR, they found that there were many areas for improvement. So on December 16th of 2021, the EPA announced its next steps to strengthen the regulatory framework on lead in drinking water, which includes a two-prong approach. So firstly, the EPA announced in a Federal Register notice that the LCRR, as it was published in January of 2021, would go into effect on December 16th of 2021 to support the near-term development of actions to reduce lead in drinking water. And again, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, remember that the compliance date for the LCRR is not until October 16th of 2024. All right, so secondly, the EPA announced that they will develop a new proposed rulemaking known as the Lead and Copper Rule Improvements, or the LCRI, in order to strengthen key elements of the rule, such as replacing all lead service lines, compliance tap sampling, the action and trigger levels, and prioritizing historically underserved communities. All right, next slide. So when it was developed, the goal of the LCRR was to build off of the current lead and copper rule and strengthen it in order to better protect children and our communities. So the three main goals of the LCRR are to one, get the lead out of our nation's drinking water, which includes improvements to lead service line replacement. Two, to empower communities through information so that consumers can take steps to reduce their lead exposure. And three, better protect children at schools and childcare facilities. And as I stated previously, the LCRI is going to expand on these goals. So know that some of the specifics could still change. But for now, I just think it's important that we know what's in the LCRR so that we can see where we're headed and we can start planning for the future. All right, so the primary goal is to get the lead out of our nation's drinking water. So under the LCRR, systems are going to be required to adjust sampling sites to better target locations with lead service lines. So specifically with the LCRR, the TAP sample site tiering criteria has been revised to emphasize that sampling from lead service line sites. So the new tiering also recategorizes copper pipe with lead solder sites, regardless of their age. And additionally, the way that samples are used to calculate the 90th percentile has changed. So for systems with lead service lines, 100% of lead service line taps must be sampled, and all lead service line sample results must be used to calculate that 90th percentile for lead. Any additional sites beyond the required minimum will not be included when tiered sites are available. Systems will be required to follow new tap sampling procedures and to collect water that's in contact with lead service lines. So for all lead service line sites, the 5th liter must now be collected. And additionally, systems will now be prohibited from including instructions to remove and clean aerators or to conduct pre-stagnation flushing prior to the start of the required stagnation period. And finally, systems with higher levels are going to be required to sample more frequently. So the LCRR introduces a trigger level in addition to the action level, and systems that are above the trigger level but still below the action level must monitor at least annually and are not going to be eligible for that reduced triennial monitoring. Systems that are above the action level are going to be required to monitor every 6 months with results at or below the action level for 2 years. All right, next slide. So based on those sampling results, systems with elevated lead levels will reevaluate their existing corrosion control treatment or conduct a treatment study so that they're prepared to respond quickly when necessary. So systems are going to have to pay attention to individual locations with elevated levels of lead by identifying the cause and mitigating the problem. And this is what's going to be called the find and fix approach. And it's also important to highlight that there's still going to be flexibility for small systems so that they can protect public health by taking the action that makes sense for their community. The small system flexibility would apply to all non-transient, non-community systems and all community systems that serve 10,000 people or fewer. The compliance alternatives for these systems include 1, full lead service line replacement, that's replacing all lead service lines within 15 years. 2, installation and maintenance of optimized corrosion control treatment. 3, installation and maintenance of point of use devices. Or 4, replacement of all lead bearing plumbing fixtures at every tap where water could be used for human consumption. It's important to point out that some of those options, such as the point of use devices, could have limited applicability just due to the need for 100% participation and access. So overall, small systems that exceed the trigger level are going to be required to recommend a compliance option. They'll then obtain approval. And then if the system subsequently exceeds the lead action level, then it's going to need to implement that approved option. All right, next slide. All right, so the final feature of this first goal is that focus on replacing more lead service lines. So before I go on, I just want to take the time to go over the definition of a lead service line. I know this is a lot of text, but just if you print these slides later, you'll have this for reference. So the LCRR defines a lead service line as a portion of pipe that is made of lead, which connects the water main to the building inlet. A lead service line may be owned by the water system, owned by the property owner, or both. For the purposes of this subpart, a galvanized service line is considered a lead service line if it ever was or is currently downstream of any lead service line or service line of unknown material. If the only lead piping serving the home is lead gooseneck, pigtail, or connector, and it is not a galvanized service line that is considered a lead service line, then the service line is not considered a lead service line. And for the purposes of 141.86A only, which, by the way, deals with sample site locations, a galvanized service line is not considered a lead service line. So we here at TCEQ are still in the planning stages for a number of things related to the LCRR. So if this definition raises any concerns for you, please feel free to reach out to us because we would love to get that feedback. All right, next slide. So this is an image that TCEQ developed that shows some of the key features of a drinking water service line, similar to what we see here in Texas. And I just want to note down at the bottom, the delineation between public and private sides of the service line. All right, so with the focus on replacing more lead service lines, the EPA is going to, for the first time, require systems to develop a public service line inventory and create a plan for removing all lead service lines. Again, the LCRR outlines a new trigger level in addition to the action level. So systems that are above that trigger level of 10 parts per billion are going to be required to work with the TCEQ to set an annual goal for replacing lead service lines. And water systems that are above the action level of the lead action level of 15 parts per billion are going to be required to fully replace a minimum of 3% of the number of known or potential lead service lines annually. It's also important to note that the LCRR will prohibit testing out to avoid replacing lead service lines. And again, we're still going to wait for the development of the LCRI to discuss the trigger level and the development of those replacement plans any further. But the important thing that I want you all to take away from this is that emphasis on removing those lead service lines, not just controlling corrosion. And so in order to do that, water systems need to start creating those service line inventories. Okay, next slide. All right, so before we go on to the second goal of the LCRR, I just want to take a minute to discuss those service line inventories in a little bit more detail. So the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations, and specifically we're talking about 40 CFR 141.84, outlines the requirements for lead service line inventories, and it states that inventories must include all service lines connected to the public water distribution system, regardless of the ownership status. All right, next slide. Okay, so who is required to submit an inventory? And the answer is all community and non-transient, non-community water systems. So essentially all public water systems that are currently being regulated under the lead and copper rule must submit a service line inventory to the TCEQ. This inventory should be submitted as soon as practical, but no later than October 16th of 2024. This inventory is required just once for systems who are non-lead only, and for all others, an updated inventory is going to be required either annually or triannually, depending on the system's sampling schedule. Also want to note that for community systems, the service line inventory is required to be in the system's consumer confident report as well. Okay, next slide. All right, and this might be the most important slide of my presentation, and that's just to send out the message to don't wait. Creating a service line inventory is not an easy task, and that October 16, 2024 deadline is going to be here before you know it. And I know there's still some big question marks in the air as we're all waiting for more information about the LCRI. But requiring systems to develop an inventory is something that's not likely to change. So this is something that water systems can and should be doing right now. All right, next slide. Okay, so to develop your inventory, the LCRR requires that public water systems review these sources of information. So that's all construction and plumbing codes, permits, and existing records, all water system records, including distribution maps, drawings, historical records on each service connection, meter installation, historical capital improvement or master plans, and standard operating procedures, and all inspection and records of the distribution system. These are sources of information that you can start gathering right now for review and in preparation for developing your inventory. All right, next slide. Okay, so now, big question. What will the inventory include? So TCEQ is currently developing some inventory forms. There's going to be a form for systems who are non-lead only, and a separate form for systems who have any of the other service line materials in their system. And these are going to be made available to the public as soon as practical. So the LCRR requires that the public water system review all available sources of information that would detail sources of detail the materials of the service line. So we intend for both of these forms to include a record review component to show what records were used to determine the service line material. We also know that denoting that service line material is a crucial part of the inventory. So depending on what form your water system is filling out, this will either be represented by a service line material table showing that your system is entirely non-lead, or a more detailed table that categorizes each service line into one of the 4 service line material categories. So either non-lead, lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or lead status unknown. And keep in mind that this would also require the delineation between public and private ownership in that line count. Let me also give you this forewarning. So lead status unknown categorization is going to be treated similarly to lead and galvanized requiring replacement until that material is confirmed. So that means that folks that are reporting lead status unknown on this, first inventory are going to have to, they're going to have to, the same requirements for posting the lead public education and for developing replacement plans similar to the folks who are reporting lead or galvanized requiring replacement. So I highly recommend that your water system attempt to confirm that material of the service line as soon as possible, because the more you know, the less work you're going to need to do in the future for inventories and for the replacement plans. Additionally, for systems whose service lines are not or for whose system is not entirely non-lead, TCEQ would like to see street addresses, including the street name, the number, city, and zip code associated with each service line in the inventory. Federal rule allows for a secondary identifier, such as an account number or a meter number. And as we're developing these forms, that's something we're considering, just so that when the system has to publish their inventory, they can still maintain some customer privacy. Finally, TCEQ intends to include a certification of completion component that would require a water system representative to certify under penalty of law that all information is true and correct to the best of your ability. The cooperation among all parties associated with the water system is required to complete this form accurately. Just also wanted to note that in April, TCEQ held its first LCRR stakeholder group meeting to discuss the development of these forms. So if you'd like to participate, if you want to just participate in that conversation further, then be on the lookout for our next meeting, which will most likely be in July. All right, next slide. All right, so now let's move on to the second goal of the LCRR. With the second goal of empowering communities, homeowners will learn about elevated levels of lead in their home or system sooner. So systems will be required to conduct public notification to consumers within 24 hours of being notified of a 90th percentile lead action level exceedance. And additionally, systems must provide notice to customers whose individual tap sample is greater than 15 micrograms per liter within 3 days. All right, next slide. They're also going to understand where lead service lines are in their community and how to protect their family from exposure to lead in drinking water. Water systems will also notify homeowners and building owners about opportunities to replace lead service lines, including information about financial assistance programs. Okay, next slide. All right, and finally, the third goal is to better protect children at schools and childcare facilities. So again, to define some terms, a childcare facility means a location that houses a licensed provider of childcare, daycare, or early learning services to children as determined by state, local, or tribal licensing agency. A school means any building or buildings associated with public, private, or charter institutions that primarily provides teaching and learning for elementary or secondary students. And an elementary school means a school classified as elementary by state and local practice and composed of any span of grades, including pre-K, but not above grade 8. Again, TCQ is still in the planning stages for a number of things related to the LCRR. So if any of these definitions raise any concern for you, please feel free to reach out to us because we'd love to get that feedback. So with this final goal, community systems are now going to be required to test at elementary schools and childcare facilities. So systems will be required to develop a list of customers or service connections that provide water to schools or licensed childcare providers. And then testing must be conducted at these facilities over a 5-year period, testing 20% of facilities each year. This testing will be in accordance with the EPA's 3 T's approach for reducing lead in drinking water in schools and childcare facilities. And the results will be provided to the sampled facility, to the TCQ, and to state and local health departments. The system will additionally be required to certify annually that it met all those notification and sampling requirements. Okay, next slide. So after sampling, schools and childcare facilities will be more likely to implement a comprehensive testing program. After 5 years, they'll continue to receive annual outreach, and they'll have the opportunity to be tested for lead by the system on request. And additionally, just want to note that secondary schools can request this testing at any time. All right, next slide. Okay, so now let's talk about next steps. So water systems must comply with the previous lead and copper rule as it was codified in the July 1st, 2020 CFR and as it is currently written in the Texas Administrative Code until the LCRR compliance date of October 16th of 2024. I think I've said this date like 8 times now. So it's important to note that this October 16th, 2024 date is also the date to turn in those service line inventories. Just like you, TCQ is still anticipating some more guidance from the EPA. So once we have more information, we're going to be developing and issuing additional resources to help public water systems. And then finally, once the LCRI is proposed, then the TCQ will work to codify those rule requirements. All right, next slide. So this slide just has a timeline, just in case there's some confusion, because I know I've said a whole bunch of dates here. So starting with January 15th of 2021, that's when the final LCRR was published. But then we see January 20th of 2021, that's when that presidential executive order put the LCRR back into review. Then in December 16th of 2021, that's when the EPA announced there would be no changes to the LCRR, and they also introduced that new idea of the LCRI. And you see we're still in early spring 2022, so that's when we're expecting EPA to provide more information about the LCRI. Summer 2024, we're expecting the publication of the LCRI. And then finally, October 16th, 2024, that's that compliance date for the LCRR. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now that we've discussed the timeline and some next steps, let's just talk about what you as a water system can be doing right now. So firstly, you can set yourself up for success with the LCRR by complying with the current lead and copper rule. I would tell all water systems, if you don't do this already, to strengthen that relationship with your laboratory, become familiar with the Drinking Water Watch website. And if you have any questions, please don't guess, just reach out to us. The lead and copper monitoring team here at the TCQ we're here to help, and we're happy to help. Many systems unfortunately get issued monitoring and reporting violations that could have easily been avoided. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of systems don't even realize that something went wrong until they get that violation letter. So if your system struggles to stay in compliance with the lead and copper rule currently, then I really hate to say this, but the compliance requirements for the LCRR are not going to get any easier. But I will say that I know that everyone that's attending here today is already on the right track because you're seeking information, you're trying to stay informed of all the latest updates, and I encourage you to please keep that up. Please sign up for our courtesy reminder system. Please continue to attend meetings, and please keep in touch. These are all habits that are going to ensure that you're successful when it comes time to comply with the LCRR. Secondly, I would encourage everyone to take the time to read the LCRR. I've condensed a whole lot of information into this talk, and I applaud you for taking the time to attend this presentation, but I hope that you don't stop there. Knowledge is power, and I encourage you all to just empower yourselves and read the LCRR for yourself. Third thing I would say is to start work on that service line inventory. So as I mentioned in the presentation, the LCRR outlines some minimum requirements for those inventories. And so you can get started on that while we're still waiting on further guidance. Please start right away. Additionally, just knowing that end goal is to get the lead out, now is a great time to start working to get ahead of the game. So once your system has a sense of its service line inventory, then you're going to have a better sense of what funding options could be available to you. Check out EPA's website and other federal websites to determine what grants and programs may be available to your water system. I know that HUD, USDA, TWDB all have grants that could work for you. And then finally, if your system is currently on the corrosion control pathway due to an action level exceedance, source corrosivity, identified plan and technical review, or simultaneous compliance issues, then your system should keep moving forward and working towards optimization so that you can increase your chances of compliance with the LCRR when that compliance date comes. All right, next slide. All right, so this slide just has some links from the EPA in case you'd like to do any further reading. You can do next slide too. And then finally, here is my information along with the information for the Lead and Copper Rule Program. Also want to note that we have a new email address specifically for questions related to the LCRR, and that is simply going to be lcrr@tcq.texas.gov. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or the program because we're happy to help. And I know I kind of went a little bit longer than expecting, so if there's any questions, I think we can try to squeeze a few of those in now.
The first one, define lead service lines. Is this the citizen-owned service line, or do you mean distribution service mains?
So that's exactly why I included that definition in the presentation. So if you print out the presentation slides, you have that definition of a lead service line, but from the main to the building inlet. So both sides, private and public, that is all the lead service line.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one in the chat is, are the schools and daycare facilities going to be responsible for taking their own samples?
That is an excellent question, and I think that's something that we're kind of hoping to get a little more guidance on with the LCRI. But at this time, I think we can expect it to maybe be similar to our current tap sampling procedures where the school would take their own samples. You'd leave instructions and sample bottles, and they would collect a sample and bring it back to the system operator.
Okay.
And for the school and daycare facility testing, again, all of the language of the LCRR is written as for responsibility for the water system. So the water system is responsible for conducting this testing and paying for it.
Okay, and there's that last question there, Laura, regarding a public notice that will be required for any unknown service lines in our submitted inventory. Is the required language available now?
Yes, it is. It is in the LCRR. If you would like a specific citation, just shoot me an email. I can give you that specific citation for that language.
Okay, one last question we'll do before we move on. Will the water system be responsible to replace the private service lead line?
So the private side, yes, does need to be replaced. Again, I know that that's a big question about who pays for the private side. I don't think it's necessarily on the water system, but certainly I think maybe our next speakers can maybe help answer this too. But we've heard different things at TCQ about how people are planning to achieve this, either by raising their utility rates or applying for some of these grants, working with the customer to pay for this. There is, with those replacement plans, you will have kind of some timelines of how much needs to be replaced over time. So and we're talking about a full replacement, so no partial replacements. This will be a full replacement of the private side, if it is lead or galvanized requiring replacement.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And in the interest of time, we will move on. But now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. We are fortunate to have Stacy Walters, Regulatory Administrator for the City of Fort Worth Water Department, with us today. Stacy's responsibilities include oversight and coordination for the utility's environmental legislative activities and oversight of the laboratory testing activities of the Fort Worth Water Department. She started her career in environmental testing in private industry prior to joining the City of Fort Worth in 1996. Her 30-plus years of experience in environmental science has afforded her opportunities in project management, regulatory compliance, and program maintenance as required for federal and state regulations. And Stacy, you may begin your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elena. And I first want to thank North Central Texas Council of Governments for setting up this webinar for all of the utilities to see how we're preparing for this lead and copper rule revision. So today I'm going to talk to you about Fort Worth's preparations for the lead and copper rule revisions. Next slide, please. So in Fort Worth, we focused on 4 areas. We focused on the service line inventory. We also were focusing on our water quality, as well as how we're going to collaborate with all the different entities, and also budgeting. And one other area we focused on, which I'm not going to talk about during my presentation, but my coworker, Mary Gugliuzza, will talk about the public outreach. So in the service line inventory, we were looking at all of our service information throughout our system. As part of that process, we were actually about to replace all of our meters with automated metering. And so this was an opportunity for the utility to look at everything in our system. We're also looking at our water quality, as I've indicated, as part of our corrosion control, and how we're collaborating and setting up those processes, as well as budgeting. Next slide, please. So what's the timeline for compliance with the lead and copper rule revision? As Ms. Higgins indicated, in December of 2021, the effective date was put in place by EPA for the lead and copper rule revisions. But one thing I want to stress here is that EPA also said that they're going to look at lead and copper rule improvements. And so from that date of December 16th until the compliance date, there may be some improvements that we need to pay attention to. Next. So on October 16th of 2024, this is when we have to be in compliance. So the things that we're looking at in Fort Worth is we're developing our list of schools that we'll have to sample. We're also looking at our licensed childcare facilities for sampling. We're also preparing our service line inventory, as well as our lead service line replacement plan. So in that lead service line inventory, that's part of the automated metering process that we're developing right now. We're looking at the meters, the service line material information, as well as documenting the meter size. As part of our replacement plan, I want to say that Fort Worth is now doing partial lead service line replacements. That's where we're replacing everything on the city-owned portion of the meter. But we are also going to be looking at how we're going to impact and prepare for replacement on the private side as well. Next. And so as we prepare for the compliance date on October 16th of 2024, we anticipate that our first monitoring for our schools and daycares will be January of 2025. Also, we want to look at our tap sample sites as we're gathering all the inventory information, determining what tiers we're going to move some of those locations into, as well as a list of our water quality parameter sites that's directly related to the lead and copper rule, and also a copy of our sampling protocol will be provided to those individuals who are sampling. Next slide, please. So on our data collection, we're approximately 94% complete. That's a moving target because as each day goes by, we're getting closer and closer to our target of 100% completion. We started this process in 2016, so we're constantly gathering data. And as most of you are aware, our city is growing by leaps and bounds. And so this information is moving every day. So as we collect the information, we're looking at the service material. We're also looking at the meter size. We're pulling the GPS coordinates, but we're also pulling the meter number for all that information as well. Next slide. So since we started our inventory in 2016, we're more than 285 connections in our system. As you can see, we're approximately 283 now we've collected data on. Out of all those meters that we've collected data on, we've found 1,833 lead service lines. Of those, we found 10 lead service lines on the customer-owned portion of the meter. And then we've replaced more than 1,800 lead service lines in our system as well. And now that the new rule also requires us to document galvanized requiring replacement, we have more than 1,000 meters of those requirement. So EPA has mandated that we document the information. So the things that they're telling us that we need to do is we need to document where we have lead, where there is non-lead, where there is galvanized requiring replacement. And basically what that means, if you had lead on the utility-owned portion side of the meter and it's galvanized on the customer-owned portion, then that is galvanized requiring replacement and also unknown. But one of the things we're doing in Fort Worth, we're also adding another category, and that category is going to be other, because what we are finding also where we have a meter, there may be a vacant lot, and we don't want to document that as an unknown, so we're going to put those as other as well. And as we complete our collection of all this data, we're going to actually go back and look at each of our unknowns to figure out if we can determine what the service material is. Of course, because it's unknown, most of the time it's because you can't see the service coming out of the meter. So we're going to take a second look at that information so we can try and diminish as many unknowns as possible. But we're also going to pull out the vacant lot information from the category that we have, because when we started this process, as I indicated, we started it back in 2016. And so when we were looking at unknowns, we would put that as a vacant lot. But since the rule change with the effective date back in 2021, we realized that we need to go back and pull out all those areas where we don't have a structure there. And so we're going to pull those out to document what that's as another category. Next slide. So one of the other things we're looking at is our water quality. So for work, we did our corrosion control study. We submitted the findings to TCEQ to become optimized. Back in 2020, of December of 2020, TCEQ accepted our recommendation for our optimization. And then we had to do our water quality parameters for a minimum of 6 months. And so we just finalized our corrosion control at the end of 2021. So what that means is that we're monitoring our corrosion control to make sure that we're not producing water that's corrosive. So we have a minimum pH criteria for our system, and we're documenting that information for not just our distribution sites, but also for our entry points as well. Next slide. So here I want to talk a little bit more about our proactive monitoring to prepare for more stringent requirements. So The new rule requires a 10 pp trigger level, which is our 90th percentile calculation. So as we go in and identify all these lead services that we're finding, whether that's on the utility-owned portion of the meter or the customer-owned portion, that's going to change our tier determination. And then we're also looking at fifth leader sampling as well as the find and fix criteria for the 15 ppb. I do want to talk a little bit about the sampling process as well. Next, please. So the new rule now says that for our compliance monitoring for lead and copper, and this will be for the single family homes, we have to do 5-liter sampling. So your first liter will be used for your copper testing, and your 5th liter will be used for your lead testing. That is a significant change from what we're doing now in the lead and copper rule. I also want to talk about the testing requirements for school and licensed child care facility, because it is different according to the EPA 3Ts. Right here we have 5 liters for the 3T. It's going to require you to have a 250 meter bottle for those daycares and schools. So it's important that the utility understands you're going to have 2 different sample containers, one for the compliance monitoring for your single family homes, but then for your schools and child care facilities, you're going to have a 250 liter bottle for the testing for those sites as well. Next. So I just want to point out there are 2 things that may change in the rule based on the lead and copper rule improvements based on EPA's comments, and that may be the 10 ppb trigger level and also the 5th liter sampling. As with Fort Worth, I'm sure you're thinking this is going to be a cost to your utility because you're going from 1 liter to 5 liters, but also it's going to be a lot of communication with your customer to help them understand that they now have to do 5 liters of monitoring for your lead and copper rule compliance. Next slide. So we've developed partnerships for reaching out with our different groups. And so one of the reasons why I put in this presentation, collaboration is such a big, important part of this rule. Next. Within our utility, we have different groups. So we're collaborating with our meter services group. They're the ones out there taking all the inventory information. They're documenting what they're finding on the utility-owned portion of the meter, but also on the private side of the meter. We have our field operations that is part of their routine maintenance through main breaks and leaks. If they find the lead service, they're automatically removing those lead services. They're also documenting that information for the customer as well. And then we have our customer service group where we're working with them to provide information on any letters we send out to those customers, but also how do we flag those accounts for future reference when a customer comes in and maybe set up a service, but also if there's any disruption of service, how we're going to engage with those customers. And that's why we have our public engagement group here. And our capital delivery group is responsible for all of our capital projects for the lead line replacements, which I indicated earlier, we're doing partial lead service line. But as we move into the find and fix part of this, if we exceed those action levels, then we got to work with our customers to figure out why we're seeing lead on the customer side of the meter. Because one of the things I want to stress, this is a rule that involves the premise plumbing, which as part of that process, we don't know what's in the customer's home. We don't know if it's a faucet, if it's a pipe. So we're going to have to work really closely with them. And then our water IT group, we're working with them. So when we have to make our inventory available to the public, we have all that information available, as well as our laboratory, making sure that we have 2 sets of bottles on hand, making sure they understand what the processes will be for the testing, but also for the sampling and the paperwork that's involved for that. Next. So we're also working with our other city departments. In Fort Worth, we have an ordinance that's regulated by our code compliance where all commercial child care facilities are now testing for lead. So we've had that program for years. So we're working with our code enforcement because they go into all of our commercial daycares, they do an assessment, and then they determine how many faucets that daycare will have to test. And so we're going to continue to work with them because we don't want to disrupt that program to make sure we're meeting our regulatory requirements, but also maintaining the ordinance for City of Fort Worth. And then there's our neighborhood services group, as well as our planning and development group, to make sure that when we come across lead or how we're working with our developers, because in Fort Worth, we have a lot of areas that are being redeveloped. And so some of those areas are older areas and some of them are not. But making sure they understand as part of their projects, if we find lead, what are the steps we need to take to properly remove and test as well. Next. So we will also be working with TCEQ. We will have to make our inventories available to TCEQ on an annual basis, but we also have to do notification to those customers where we find lead, as well as the Texas Education Agency, which has a database for all public schools, and then the Texas Department of State Health Services, which has a database of record for child care facilities. So we'll have to be working with all these facilities and making sure we understand how all those agencies are going to need information as part of the lead and copper rule revision. Next. So locally, we'll be working with our county health departments. As part of our daycare facilities, not only do we have to make the test results available to the individual daycares, but we also have to make it available to TCEQ. We have to make it available to the state organization, which is the Texas Department of State Health Services, but also to our local health departments. And so as we continue to work through this process, our schools, one of the things that the rule requires is that any school built prior to January 1st of 2014 has to be tested. So schools after that date don't have to be tested, and it does require all elementary schools. And based on the rule requirements, elementary schools are schools up to 6th grade. So we'll be working with our schools, and that not just include your independent school districts, but also your private schools, charter schools, parochial schools. In Fort Worth, we've done some testing with our Fort Worth Independent School District, so we have some history. We know how this process works. So we'll be working with some of the other schools, the private schools, to move them along into this program as well. And then, of course, we talked about the licensed child care facilities. The only thing that we found out as part of this process is that we have the commercial daycares, but we also have licensed daycares that are in single family homes. And so that's going to be a new process for us, and working with those homeowners to make sure that we get those schools tested as well. Next slide. So then there's some other collaboration efforts that we're going to work through, and that will be we're working to see if we need to do a certification for plumbers. As we've indicated, this is a find and fix rule. So some of the problems may be on the private side of the service. And so having someone to go in and do an assessment may help us understand why that customer may be exceeding the action level, or if they have a high lead level. Also working with our realtors to understand how this rule will impact them, as well as some of our social service organization, builders and developers. And then we're also looking at equity issues. What we found in Fort Worth when we started doing our inventory is that most of our lead services are in the older parts of our city, not in the outer parts of the city or in our suburban areas. So making sure we understand that process and working with those customers to develop a plan to not only have conversations with them, but also how do we work with them. What we are also doing in Fort Worth, if we find a lead service, either on the customer side of the meter or on the utility owned portion, we're offering free lead tests to those customers just to help them along. But also will be providing picture filters for those customers that will be exceeding the lead action level, just so we can have some mitigation efforts in place if, for example, we have a customer that has a lead level above the 15 action level, 15 ppb. Next slide. So one of the last things I want to talk about as part of our lead and copper revision rule is, what are these costs going to do to impact us? What we realize immediately is that we're going to need some help. There are a lot of moving parts to this rule. I talked about the inventory. I talked about the water quality. I talked about schools and childcare facilities. So we've hired a full-time staff member to assist with this process. But some of the things that we're also looking at, as I mentioned, you're going to have to maintain 2 types of bottle sizes for your lead and copper testing. For those of you that don't have an in-house laboratory, you want to make sure that the lab understands that there may be some different requirements for the schools versus the single-family homes. We're also looking at our pitcher filters. The rule requires that you provide a pitcher and at least 3 replacement filters for that customer. And that may mean that when you have a disruption in service, if that service has a lead, then there's going to be some requirements that you have to do there. Also, printing and mailing all of our public outreach information, that would be the brochures, also providing them letters, the testing that will be required to go along with that. And then as part of our lead and copper compliance, what we found, if we provide our customers with $25 gift cards, they've been more open to us sampling and for them participating in our lead and copper monitoring. And then there are staff resources for program compliance as well. Next slide. So the path forward for Fort Worth. Next. So we want to complete our inventory replacement. Our goal in Fort Worth is to have that done by the end of this year. Next. We're going to collaborate with our internal stakeholders as well as our outside entities. Next slide. We're going to develop plans. We're looking at our sampling pools. We're looking at our lead service line replacement. We're actually working on plans for our schools and daycares now. How do we talk to them? How do we put together packets to help them understand what paperwork needs to be completed? We're also working on SOPs and then our communications. Next slide. So we're also looking at monitoring tools. As we've indicated, the schools and childcare facilities are going to be a 5-year process, but you're going to have some daycares that come into that system within that 5 years. So we're looking at putting together some dashboards to help us with that information, some auto reminders. Our laboratory is actually going to a web portal, so they're not having to send out this information. The customer can go retrieve it and then generate it, some automated work orders. Next. So as we evaluate and update, this is going to be an ongoing monitoring to implement our process improvements. Just from 2016 to now, we've learned so much as part of this process, and we're constantly improving and making updates to our process as well. Next slide. So I want to leave you with something to help you with your to-do list. So some of the things that you will want to do by the October 16th of 2024 is that you want to develop your service line inventory. You want to eliminate as many unknowns as you can, because an unknown, according to the revision, is a lead service. You want to prepare your website for a displaying, which will have to be available by the October 16th. You want to develop your lead service line replacement plan, including how you're going to find and fix your process. You want to develop an SOP for disturbances of lead, unknown, galvanized downstream of lead. You want to prepare a sampling plan for your schools and registered daycares In Fort Worth, we're gathering all that information now because we want to understand what our capacity needs to be in terms of testing, but also working with the schools to make sure they understand as you prepare for this process. Just remember your schools are not open all year long. So you want to make sure you get your school testing done when they're in school, in session, but your childcare facilities are usually open 12 months a year. So those are just some of the things you want to think about as you're preparing for this. You want to update your sampling pool, which includes your new tiers. So as you find galvanized requiring replacement or unknowns, those locations are going to move into a different tier system. You want to revise your sampling protocol. As I've indicated, you got 5-liter monitoring for your single family homes, but you got 250 milliliters for schools and childcare facilities. And then if you don't have an in-house lab, you want to start having conversations with laboratories, if you don't, to contract with them to make sure all that information is available to you and they understand what your process will be. But also you want to develop your public education materials and notifications as well. And one of the things that I do want to stress to you, the rule does require that if a customer does not want to participate in monitoring, that we have to get them to opt out. So we're actually working on a form to prepare for those customers as well. I want to thank everyone for allowing me the opportunity to share how Fort Worth is preparing for the lead and copper rule. My contact information is here on this slide. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. That was great information. I really appreciate it. And I know all the attendees do too. And before we take some time for questions, I want to allow some time to hear the perspectives from smaller utilities. So we're going to move ahead because the cities of Irving and Colleyville have been gracious enough to share with us today their preparations. So we'll go ahead and get started with the city of Irving. We have Daniel Grimes, Environmental Compliance Manager with the city of Irving, and he's going to share with us for about 5 minutes what they're doing to prepare. So thank you so much, Daniel. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. All right, so our primary focus at the city of Irving is to develop our inventory. So we've got about 50,000 connections, and 30,000 of those were developed before the 1988 lead ban. So those are the ones that we're really zeroing in on. Early on, we knew that we needed a good way to manage all of this data. And we have a pretty strong IT group here. So we went with the GIS Esri solution to where they could pull in all of the county appraisal data along with the street address or utility assets to log along with them. We began with going through a lot of records, and we found, that on the city side, we would find a lot of information, and on the private side, we'd find information, but there weren't a lot that were lining up that we were finding both pieces that we needed for those addresses. So we determined it was time to put boots on the ground, and we developed SOPs for our field crews while they're out with meter leaks and different things like that, where they could start capturing that data with photos in our work order system so that we would have it. And then we made an addendum to our meter replacement program so that those guys, while they're out changing meters, would dig up and identify the service for city and customer sides. We did also require them to keep photos so that we can tie that to the Esri solution, and we created a follow-up program to make sure that they're doing it the way that it's called out. And we're about 4,000 in at this point, and we're yet to find any lead. We also thought it was important to go ahead and start our notification process pamphlets in case we did run into lead, and we've developed a picture inventory where if we do find lead, we can get that out. And the staffing that Stacy was talking about earlier, we do have a dedicated lead and copper specialist, and I know it's budget time right now for a lot of you folks, so it's time to lobby for that. So we're going to be asking for another position to try to strengthen this group because we've got a lot of work moving forward as this comes through. And then communications is a piece that we're starting on now, both with the schools to make sure that they know this is coming and they're prepared for it, and then with the community to make sure that they understand what we're doing and what our goals are. that's about where we're at now. I appreciate the time to talk.
Thank you so much. That's very valuable. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I know that just listening to our peers is helpful to us all. So thank you, Daniel. And we are going to move on to the city of Colleyville, who have also agreed to share with us today what they're doing. And we are lucky that we have Don Baker, who's the water and wastewater operations superintendent at Colleyville. And we have John Escamilla, field operations manager. Go ahead and please share. Thank you so much.
Well, we'd like to just start off by saying we're doing similar work as to what Daniel just explained. So we are trying to develop our inventory service line and identify everything. We are a smaller community. We have approximately 10,600 connections. So we don't have the staff like other cities do. Hopefully with this new rule, maybe we can make maybe we have a good excuse now as to why to add some staff in the future here. But we're also working closely with our GIS department and engineering division to help identify and make maps where we can look at subdivisions that instead of having to look at every service line, we're trying to take the approach that we can look at everything built 1988 and older, and maybe then we can go out and we can start identifying these service lines. So that's kind of the approach we're taking right now. We are working also with the city of Grapevine. They're a partnering city of ours, and we share the same school district. So what we want to do is the approach we want to take is we want to work together with them, and we don't want us, we don't want the city of Colleyville saying one thing and then the city of Grapevine saying something else to the district, even though we share the same type of schools. So we're going to take a unified approach, and we're going to work with one another to develop a game plan, to speak to the schools, to educate them, to also take the samples. We're thinking of actually city staff taking the samples, just maybe it may complicate things or take the complication out of the process. But we're still not sure, with handing out handouts and directions on what to do, there still could be some error in the way that the samples are taken. So that's kind of where we're at, Don.
Well, along with that, we've reached out to Stacy
Yes.
in Fort Worth, and we appreciate her team and all the efforts that she gave us and all the advice she gave us. So with that, we've came back and we've got several CIP projects going on, and we're taking the time now while the contractors are out there doing the work that we're actually doing on-site inspections of the service lines and gathering that information as these new lines are getting replaced. And like I said, we've reached out with code, and we're trying, right now we're at the beginning stages of gathering all that data and figuring out where we are. So, I mean, we're moving slow, and we're trying to eat around the pie, and we're going to get there.
Yeah, and I would like to thank Stacy as well. She has helped us tremendously. We did meet with her, and she gave us a better understanding of the rule, and she's been so helpful. And if you have any questions, I'm sure she would not mind answering any. Same with us. If we can help anyone out, just shoot us an email, give us a call. We're all in this together. So that's kind of what we got and where we're at.
That's all we have.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And I want to make sure we have time for our third speaker. So I'm going to keep moving on ahead, and hopefully there'll be time at the end before noon for questions. But I want to make sure we get to our third speaker first. So I would like to introduce her. She is Mary Gugliusa, Media Relations and Communications Coordinator for the City of Fort Worth Water Department, where she has worked for more than 26 years. During her career with Fort Worth Water, she has overseen internal and external communications, media relations, crisis communications, and public involvement. Mary has served and continues to serve on many professional organizations in her career, and she is very proud to have been honored in 2011 with the George Warren Fuller Award by the Texas section of the American Water Works Association. She is a native of New Orleans, and she has a journalism degree from Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, now Texas State University. So Mary, I transfer controls over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here today, and I'll try and get through this a little quickly. I just want to say you've heard a lot about this rule, and it's already overwhelming. The public outreach aspects of this rule are very overwhelming. There's an entire section of the rule, 141.85, devoted to public outreach, but there's outreach in other aspects of the rule specifically called out. So you really need to read the whole rule, but at the same time, you might have to read the original rule or the rule that's on the books today, because there are references to things that have to be included that aren't in the revisions because nothing changed. They're in the rule already. So just keep that in mind when you do this. Go ahead to the next slide. When I looked at the rule, it helped me to break it down into different areas and where there's areas that need to have public outreach. So this is just what helped me in looking at it. And that's how I'm going to go through it with you. So let's go to the next slide. So the inventory, as you've heard already a little bit, you've got to make the inventory publicly available. And you're going to have to tell people in your annual water quality report how they can access it. If you're a large system, meaning you serve more than 50,000 people, again, that's people, not connections, you're going to have to post it on the website. And that location identifier, Laura alluded to the fact TCQ wants the address. I think addresses, that's just my opinion, is the way to go, because you're going to be generating phone calls to your utility if you say, we have 3 lead services in the 1200 block of Main Street or something like that. And people are going to know, well, which ones, where? Now you're going to have to identify those that are, but if we'll get to some other things that where people might be moving into those properties and have questions. So then but when you do identify an LSL as lead service line, galvanized requiring replacement or unknown materials, you've got to notify these particular customers at several different points. First, when it's within 30 days of completing the inventory, then you have to do it annually. Anytime, and Lord knows we've got lots of house sales going on in our area, people moving all over the place. So when new customers move into a location and set up service at a location that has one of these 3 designated types of lines, at the time they initiate service, you need to make them aware of that. Now, there's different language for each of the 3 different types in the rule. There's some commonality, but there's also some subtle differences. So you need to understand that as you're putting together your outreach materials. Next slide. Your inventory is going to drive your compliance testing. Stacy talked about this. You're going to have to notify those customers if they're below the action level within 30 days of what their results are, or within 3 days if they're at 15 or above. And you're communicating with the occupants of this place, not necessarily the property owners. You can choose to do both, but the rule says you have to communicate with the people who are occupying the building where the test was done. So that, and if that is an apartment complex, you've got to communicate with all of them. But the rule does allow you to post that in a common area or bulletin board for the facility. So something else to keep in mind. The overall results are going to have to go to your state and local health departments, and you're going to have to make them publicly available. Now, you do not have to list the individual address at which you took each sample, but you do have to, site 1, site 2, et cetera, and list the individual results. In addition, what I don't have on this slide is it's going to change how you report it in your annual water quality report. Right now, we report 90th percentile and number of sites exceeding the action level. You're going to have to add to that in the CCR reporting the range of samples that you collected. during your sampling compliance period. And so keep that in mind. Again, there's also that other CCR info that's got to be in there that I mentioned on the previous slide. And if you have exceedances, they're going to require outreach. You exceed the action level, it is now a tier 1 violation with 24-hour notice to everyone in your water system. So please keep that in mind. And then that trigger level, over 10 milligrams per liter, there's additional notification to people with those 3 types of service lines that you've got to do. And with the action level, there's more. This also starts to trigger the replacement, mandatory replacements. So, and those have outreach that goes with those mandatory replacements as well as outreach that goes with failure to meet your goals on those annual replacements. So don't have time to get in all the details here, but just want to bring those out. Next slide. So what if you do replacements? The rule actually does recognize that you may have to do partials at times. It tries to move away from partials, but I'm curious how we're going to resolve the fact that we don't have the right to enter private property, and the service line is on private property. You know, we can't go onto private property and do work if we don't have an easement. So what is that going to mean for utilities? Right now, if we do damage to something on private property, we actually hire a private plumber to do the work. We don't have to do that ourselves. But when you do have planned replacements, we're replacing a lot of old cast iron. Most of those lead service lines we find have been connected to cast iron. Not everything's got on cast iron's got lead, but where we found it's been mostly lead, mostly cast iron water lines. When we replace those, you're going to have to notify the property owners at least 45 days before you do that replacement. And you're going to have to offer to replace the private portion. The whole part of the rule is to get away from partial replacements. But you are not required to pay for it. So that's something that the rule is very specific about, but you're going to have to figure out how that's going to happen. Next slide. And then whether or not it's a planned or an unplanned. So you got a water main break, and then the break is in a location that impacts a service that serves where you have a one of those 3 categories of service lines. You have to, before you can put that back into service, you have to do notification to the customers. You also have to provide them with the pitcher filters and offer to come back and do tap sampling in 3 to 6 months. And again, that's for planned and unplanned events. So something to keep in mind. Next. The other thing we're going to have to do in our CCRs and in the letters that we send annually to these folks is tell them that if they're going to replace their line, they need to let us know, because the rule wants the utilities to replace their service line at the same time the customer is replacing their plumbing. Now, that's not always feasible. The rule recognizes that and has some options in there. But when you're notified, or when you find out after the fact that it was replaced within the last 6 months, there are steps you have to take, very similar to the steps on the previous slide. But the one thing that's not on here is the follow-up sampling on this list. So go ahead to the next slide. Disturbances. This is the one that I think is going to cause us all a whole lot of heartburn, because the way a disturbance is classified, it could be a shutoff or bypass of the water, or it could be replacing the water meter, or those other components that you see on the right-hand side of that slide. So there's different requirements for what's on the right and the left. What's on the right is much more extensive in what you have to do than what's on the left. But does a water main break count as a shutoff? And are you going to have to do notification? I haven't gone into the details of what you've got to do in these cases, but again, it is, these are the things that happen every day in our systems. And so your meter services staff, your GIS, you're going to have a way for your customer service staff. Everybody's going to have to be able to look up those addresses, your field staff out there working, and know if that location has anyone on it, or that shutout has anyone on it that's involved with a lead service line, galvanizing replacement, or unknown service line. Go to the next one. So corrosion controls talked about extensively in the rule. There's not actually a lot about public information, but I want to bring up the fact that in 2018, Congress passed America's Water Infrastructure Act, and it has a requirement in that law that in our annual water quality reports, we include information on corrosion control efforts. And that is literally the wording in the law. That's all it says, information on corrosion control efforts. So the wholesale customers of Fort Worth know that when I send them out our data every year for the CCR, there is a statement on there now that says we maintain corrosion control by doing pH adjustment. So that's as simple as it is for us, because there's not been any guidance, but we want to make sure we're in compliance with what we're supposed to be doing. Next. Stacy talked a lot about schools and daycares. I just want to make sure you understand, you need to be having discussions, and we're going to have to sit down with a lot of our wholesale customers. As Colleyville noted, they share an ISD with Grapevine. There's something like 16 ISDs that come into the city limits of Fort Worth. It's not just Fort Worth ISD whose schools we have on our system. So we're going to have to be having some coordination meetings with our wholesale customers on this fact in advance, but we need to be talking to the schools in advance. And I'm going to tell you, you need to make sure that if you're talking to the operations staffs at the schools, they're talking, or you're bringing in the public information staff, because the results go to the schools and the parents are going to want to know what's found at the schools. So their PR staff need to be involved in these discussions and aware of what's going to be happening and when it's happening, and how are they going to handle it from their end. Because there's nothing in the rule that says the utility is to publicly post these results. The rule says you provide them to the school, which is also an interesting point. If we're dealing with an ISD and not a single school, do we provide the results to the school itself or to both? That's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out in rules as well. Next. We've been doing this since 2016, as Stacy mentioned. So we actually have developed some educational materials that we are using. Now we're going to have to modify these because there's some new requirements, especially mandatory language that's going to be in almost every public educational material you put together on a whole variety and send out for various things. There's one statement that's going to be in everything. There's a lot of statements that are common to many, but there's new mandatory lead language. It's going to have to be in our water quality reports and everything with this rule. So we will have to update all of our materials as well. Next. Okay, that's all I got. I'm sure I haven't covered everything because it's super extensive on public education and outreach, and I've not gotten into the weeds of what those requirements are, but glad to try and answer any questions folks may have about this.
Thank you, Mary. That was a great presentation, and we appreciate that information. We do have a few minutes for questions. Please explain how you funded the service line replacement.
Yeah, I was kind of directing that to everybody because I know that you have different size communities. And then I had another question along that same line. Someone brought up the right of access when replacing service lines. So if you could explain how you funded it, and then also how did you deal with, replacing those lines that are private?
Stacy, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. So as I've indicated, we're currently doing partial lead service line replacement. So that's the service from the main to the meter, and that's funded through our capital improvement program. But we are also looking at other funding options for the private side, because as Mary indicated, we don't have the authority to use public funds on private property. So there are two things that we're actually looking at. We're looking at some state revolving funds through the Texas Water Development Board. And we also looked at a EPA grant for some funding options for us. And that's just going to mean we're going to have to work with those customers to see what that looks like. And it's important to understand this process because as this rule is a find and fix rule, as you start to change your tier information, what we anticipate, especially here in Fort Worth, once you concentrate that sampling pool to be mostly lead services, you're probably going to get some exceedances. So we are now looking at that and preparing to look at some funding options to see how we can assist those customers with removing the lead service, because it's going to be in the utilities benefit to not have to deal with, as Mary indicated, you got to do a public notice if they exceed the action level. And there are so many other things that we have to do. So we're looking at all the options that are available to us for funding. But as you are probably aware, we're not quite sure what that's going to look like down the road as well. We're just working through the process as it's available to us.
Thank you for that. And I am going to go ahead and wrap up. And thank you so much for attending today. I appreciate your time, and I want to extend a special thank you to our 3 speakers, Laura Higgins from TCEQ, Stacy Walters, and Mary Gugliuzza from the City of Fort Worth. Thank you for sharing your expertise and time today. And this webinar is now over.